Technology is the most powerful change in the world of education.
Everything changes.
Welcome to the Emerging Technologies in Education podcast, delivered to you by Clever Books Company.
Dear listeners, thank you for joining Emerging Technologies in Education podcast series, and we are welcoming our guest, David, today. How are you, David?
I'm fine, thank you for having me.
That's brilliant. So it's my pleasure to host you today, and I would like to first give you a word to introduce yourself and tell a little bit about your background and which country you're from.
Okay, well, I'm from the UK, and my name is David Didau, and I write an education blog called The Learning Spy. That's www.learningspy.co.uk, and I've written a couple of books about education, the most recent of which is called What Every Teacher Needs to Know About Psychology.
To elaborate a little bit more about your blog, what kind of useful information people can find there, what you're writing?
Okay. So, I write about anything that interests me, but I write a lot about cognitive science. So I look at what researchers are finding out about how students learn and how our brain works. And I write quite a lot about something I call professional skepticism, where I sort of encourage teachers to question what they're told and not to believe things just because they sound like they're good ideas.
That sounds really interesting, and I'm pretty much sure you have an audience that is digging into that. And I find myself psychology quite interesting, especially in the educational sector. So you also mentioned that you have a couple of books out there. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more what the books are about and where they can be found.
Okay, so I've written a book called The Secret of Literacy, which is about how to teach in a way which helps children to read and write better. And if I could sum it up in a sentence, I'd say if you want children to be academically successful, you need to help them have access to the language of academic success. I wrote a few years ago, I wrote another book called What If Everything You Know About Education Is Wrong? And that's about the sorts of cognitive biases that teachers often have, that often fall victim to in schools, that we might encounter when children. But also it's about, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding that sometimes I see a lot in schools, in classrooms, which is a tendency to mistake learning for performance. And so we see students perform in a particular way in the classroom. We infer from that performance that they have learned something, and then it turns out that they haven't. And there are good reasons why they don't seem to remember often what we think they should, and can predict some of those, and we can do things differently to help prevent it. But in order to accept it, I think you have to think of learning. You have to really define learning, and I define it as the retention and transfer of information. So if you can't remember something that you've been told or shown how to do, then that isn't really learning. And if you're not able to apply it to any context outside of the class that you learned it, then that's not terribly useful either. But the consequence of accepting that definition is that it means that you can no longer claim to see learning, because it doesn't happen. You can't see in the here and now whether somebody will remember something later or be able to do something elsewhere. So that has, I think, real consequences for how we set up classrooms and schools. And then the most recent published with a co-author called Nick Rose, which I said was called What Every Teacher Needs to Know About Psychology, and that's more of a textbook. So it's divided into three parts. So the first on learning and thinking, the second part on behaviour and motivation. And in it, we go through many of the popular theories of psychology and how they apply to the classroom. So they're all very rooted in classroom practice with activities for teachers to do and think about. I'm working on my latest book, which hopefully will be out by the end of the year, Making Kids, and it's looking at how and why and if we can raise children's intelligence and what the consequences of that might be, and all sorts of other good things.
You're touching really interesting points in the books about the psychology and how and why the learning goes. And I think that is really important also, like, to understand for the educator why and how to educate the kid, and also to understand the whole kid's mind, which is a lot more difficult to understand nowadays because of all this technology involved and everything, and the processes change and the whole world is changing.
Yeah, that's a common idea that I hear people say, that the internet has changed everything and the future is uncertain, and none of the things that we've traditionally taught children will necessarily will be able to rely on in the future, and that we can't train children for specific jobs because the jobs they might end up doing aren't currently invented. And you teach them any of that stuff anyway, because whatever they need to know, they could just look it up on the internet. And I think that the fundamental problem here is that, of course, the internet is great, and of course technology does mean that the world's very different, but the brains that we have are the same that our ancestors had 40,000 years ago. Evolution changed our brains, yet it may in the coming millennia, but for the foreseeable future, we've got very sort of old-fashioned cognitive architecture. And so even though we do have this capacity to look up anything that we need to know, knowing where to find something is not at all the same as knowing it. And I think that it's useful to draw a divide between information, which is something that exists externally, and knowledge, which lives and breathes inside your mind. And knowledge is only knowledge if you know it, and that once you know something, you can think about it. The converse is obviously true. Nobody can think about something they don't know. Maybe your listeners would like to try that for a moment. Try and think about something you don't know.
I think it's nearly close to impossible. It's like, like you mentioned, we don't know about the jobs, and it's like blindly walking in the darkness to make it more complicated, and not knowing what exactly to do and how to deliver the information for the kids with all the information that we have. So I think it's like really a great point out here. So, but I still
that's a good point you make, that because we don't know anything about the future, all we can do is guess, and our guesses are based on things that have happened in the past or things that we've seen elsewhere. And so all we're capable of doing when we think about the unknown is sort of assembling things that already exist inside our brains, and then calling that prediction, and it's not very reliable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, but I still try to catch your point. Like, are you positive or negative about using generally technology for educational purposes?
Oh, I use technology all the time. I wouldn't. When I write a book, I certainly don't write it with a pen on a piece of paper, because that would be time consuming and a waste of effort. So, I think technology is incredible. I use the internet to research things all the time, and so the democratization of access to information is wonderful. But I don't believe it's true that anything about modern technology has fundamentally changed the way our brains work. And so we've still got the same limitations. We're all limited by having a very, very finite capacity for processing information in working memory. So the current sort of consensus is that we can process about 4 chunks of information at once, and any more than that, and we start getting confused and forgetful and frustrated. But that once we have thought about something, then our capacity for storing that as knowledge in long-term memory is, for all practical purposes, our capacity to remember stuff is infinite. We're never going to run out of space in our lives, but that doesn't necessarily mean we can always remember the things that are stored. And so there are ways to approach education which make it easier or harder for children to retrieve the information that they have in long-term memory, and by so doing to overcome the limits of their working memories.
That's interesting. And I've recently heard quite interesting statement that aligns with what you just said, that it is good to use the technology, but also it's not like a substitution or suitable everywhere. But I recently the saying, kids are digital natives and we are digital immigrants. What do you think of
that? It's just not true. It's not true. I mean, what kids have grown up with the ability to use technology, but using it conveys no understanding. The fact that they can go on Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat doesn't tell them anything about how any of it works. Their brains aren't in any way different as a result of that. And so, it's just there's a real danger of mistaking children's facility with technology, in the same way that the cargo cults in the South Seas grew up in the early 20th century, when more primitive natives first met Western culture, and they saw things like American marine bases, airports being built on these remote South Sea islands, and they assumed that if they replicated the airport and made one out of bamboo, then planes would land. And obviously, even though they were able to copy the superficial structures, because they had no understanding of global geopolitics, planes didn't land. And so I think that's the problem with thinking of children as digital natives, is that the planes don't land.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, and
Mm-hmm.
as you said, you're using yourself technology, obviously sometimes technology makes our lives really convenient, really writing on the PC is it's quicker than writing with the hand. But is there any specific educational technology or some tools that could be useful you use and you like, and you think and
yes, there's some apps that are really, really well designed with what we know about cognitive science, and so apps really support and strengthen our memories. And so there's a really good free one which is called Memrise, Rise, one word, and that presents information to you in multiple different ways until you have a strong ability to retrieve it, and then allows for the fact that you will forget that, and then but harnesses that effect of forgetting, and then it contacts you, it sends you an email when an optimum time has passed, and then asks you to review the information again. And that's a really good little free program. There's a paid version, or not really a version, but there's a paid app called Anki app, ANKI app, which does something similar, but it's probably much better written. It's a much more sophisticated piece of software, but you do have to pay for it. And so I think both of those are brilliant tools that we can use, that really make good use of the knowledge that we have of how our brains actually work versus the way we would like them to work.
That's an amazing example. And also in the connection, you like everything connecting to the psychology and things like this, as far as I see.
Well, I mean, it would be hypocritical, I think, to say, here's what I believe, and then and not sort of link it to, and show that it connects to the things that I'm recommending are somehow connected to that. So it's not that I'm an obsessive. I don't do this in general conversation with my wife and kids, for instance, because they soon tell me that I'm getting boring. But I think when if you think in a coherent, holistic way in education, and everything that you think is you hold to account for the ideas that you recommend, then I think that really, really helps.
Yeah, absolutely. I do agree with you on this point, and I think that everything you say today is like absolutely insightful and super interesting, and also.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it is indeed. Then I have one more question to you, because I see
Yeah.
quite positive in terms of using technology for education, also for everyday life. And
Yeah.
sometimes we meet people, they say like, I don't think that technology is something good. I don't think it's gonna do something good in education, and I think it's useless.
Hmm.
What do you normally tell those people?
Well, I think the problem is that, and if we're talking about teachers, I think teachers are recommended crap technology all the time. And I think it's not a problem with technology per se. It's either useful or it's not useful. So I think I get really upset by the way that huge tech companies like Google and Apple sort of penetrate into education and sort of pin these baubles on teachers so that you can become an Apple distinguished educator or a Google certified teacher, and in this stealthy way try and get us to sort of buy their products. I'm completely against that, and so any teacher that's skeptical about that, I'd absolutely support them. But that doesn't mean that all technology is bad. There are brilliant ideas out there. Most of the good ones are free. You know, there's no end of brilliant free stuff out there that you don't have to pay for. And I think that if you can find a use for it, if it supports your teaching, if it's beneficial to your students, then that will become very quickly clear. You won't have to struggle with it. But if you're struggling with something that doesn't really make sense to you, stop doing it.
Yeah, that's a good point out there. And also, I think that it would be good to add and hear your comments on that. I was recently talking to one of the people, and I was told that yes, there is a lot of great technology out there, paid, not paid, but it's not the point here. The point here is that sometimes the technology is built for educational purposes, but companies who build this technology for educational purposes, they have little understanding what education really needs. And
Okay. Yeah, I think that's potentially a problem.
Sometimes there is software or some technology that is really cool, but it's useless for the education.
Yeah.
Is that what you meant there?
Yeah, I think there's loads of that. I mean, so some of the best examples of educational technology which is directly useful to teachers are often ones that have been made by teachers. So there's a brilliant maths website called Hegarty Maths, which was designed by a maths teacher called Colin Hegarty. And so it was rooted in his classroom experiences of what do children struggle with, what do I have difficulty with in the classroom, and he went away and made a resource that addressed the exact problems that he was having. Another really good one that I've encountered is called Bedrock Learning, and it's a way of teaching children vocabulary. And again, the people that made that are teachers. They were trying to address a problem that they were experiencing in their classrooms. And now they've designed a resource which is really, really useful for teachers who are in the same situation that they were in. And I'm much more inclined to be receptive to that sort of ed tech than I am, the big glossy program that's made by a huge company. I don't know. Maybe it's my socialist leanings, but I'm generally sceptical of big companies getting their tendrils into schools and the amount of money that's charged for some of these things. It's not that they're inherently bad. It's just, I think there are far, far better things we could spend our cash on.
Yeah, could be true, could be really true. And I totally agree with you on that. If there is so much diverse, that might be the case that the quality, or it's also built from the business perspective rather than from the education perspective, could be also the case. That's really interesting point. Yeah, David, I would like to thank you a lot for the great ideas.
It's my pleasure. It's lovely to talk to you. Thank you ever so much for having me on.
Everything changes.